It's funny because that's exactly how my friends always introduce me. It's just another regular night out with friends, I hope. Is anyone drinking the primordial soup? Because in a way, it captures the essence of what I want to convey. But we'll come back to that. I'm here this evening to try and share a few ideas with you. Ideas that I cooked up over a more than 10-year period with my friend, the late, great anthropologist, Professor David Graeber. Who, by the way, would have absolutely loved this, although I think doing it as a double act probably would have been chaos. But fun. And writing this book, The Dawn of Everything, was fun. So much fun that I've actually shown up here in Copenhagen about 6 months early, because the Danish translation is only out in the autumn. But I figured this is a good opportunity for me to learn how to say the title in Danish. So I'm looking for help here. I figure someone can teach me how to say the dawn of everything in Danish. Any offers? Oh, screw that. Okay. All right, I've got 6 months. I'll be back. And since the man with the bucket on his head has pretty much actually given you my lecture already, we should move on, I think. What I really want to try and convey, I guess, is a little bit of the mental journey that David and I went on over those 10 years. Which I guess led us to the conclusion that there's enough evidence now from my field of archaeology, his field of anthropology, to really say that we're getting towards a kind of paradigm shift in the way that we understand the big picture of human history. You know the picture, the one I'm talking about, the guy with the bucket on his head gave it to you. But we can go over it briefly again. And it's important to remember that this isn't just two guys, sitting in a corner reading books. We're talking about the cumulative results of tens of years of research by hundreds, probably thousands of archaeologists, anthropologists, historians, all over the world. That's not to say that they all agree with each other, even on the details, even on some of the larger questions. There are huge debates. But I'm going to try to explain why we came to the conclusion that there is enough cumulative evidence now to really question things that go far beyond any one scientific discipline. Questions that actually go right to the heart of what we mean by social science and philosophy. And of course, like any paradigm shift, like any change, you're working against some very deep assumptions. Deep assumptions that go back hundreds of years in Europe to the work of Enlightenment philosophers like Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century. In fact, these two guys are often presented as the originators of two opposing views of what we might call the primordial soup of humanity. What is that essence of being human that we all come from, or what they referred to as humanity in its state of nature, which is not a bad name, I suggest, for a cocktail. Who wants to make up a state of nature? They were state of nature theorists, and what that means is that they allowed themselves to speculate about what humanity might be with civilization stripped away. What is that raw kernel of humanity? Are we innately a selfish, competitive, warlike species? Or are we innately altruistic, kind, caring sort of species? What effects have culture and the growth of human populations had on those innate tendencies? Hobbes and Rousseau both produced works which sought to answer these questions, but to answer them as a kind of thought experiment, a fable almost, through which to think about the problems and the paradoxes of their own lives. So Hobbes lived through the English Civil War. Rousseau died roughly a decade before the French Revolution. And they each came up with quite radically different accounts. The story that Rousseau told in his discourse on the origins of social inequality, which, by the way, was actually written as an essay submitted to a competition in 1753, competition set by an academy in the French town of Dijon. By the way, Rousseau didn't win it. He didn't even come second. Actually, the judges refused to read the essay because he was over the word limit. So there's an inspiration to those of you who may be students and going over the word limit. It doesn't mean the end of your careers at all. In fact, you may take over the whole of human history, which Rousseau did because, the story that he told, I guess, is pretty much the standard narrative that most of us take for granted these days. Actually, it's even weirder than that. He doesn't even begin with humans living in tiny bands of hunter-gatherers. He begins by imagining people rather like himself wandering through the gardens of his country manor. Humanity begins with all of us in this strange state of isolation, almost afraid to bump into each other or form any kind of group or alliance. Imagine us living in the wild with very little property, very few things, no clothes, living from nature, but living in a state which he characterized as a very happy, innocent kind of state of nature. And then it all went wrong one day when somebody went out, put a fence, something like that, around a piece of land and began to farm it. And what today the writers of famous big history books would call the agricultural revolution took place. And after that comes us. Nothing could be the same. It all went wrong. There were surpluses for the first time in human history, and you know what humans do with surpluses? They grab them. They start setting up little militias and armies to defend them. People become territorial. Warfare appears, slavery. And all the time they're eating the fruits of all this agriculture. Populations are growing, cities appear. And of course, once cities appear, we all start to go slightly crazy, and we need central governments to control the flow of information. And before you know it, you've got kingdoms and monarchies and empires and civilization. And what does civilization mean? Well, in Rousseau's account, it means that a few people are having a rather nice time doing science and the arts and being politicians and warriors and philosophers like him. But most of humanity is toiling, laboring out in the fields, wherever it may be. Inequality in Rousseau's story is the price of civilization. Now, Thomas Hobbes almost 100 years earlier, told what is in a way an even more depressing story. Actually, Rousseau was not a sort of fatalist. Rousseau thought that somehow or other, maybe we could sort of reclaim that original human liberty and equality. It just wasn't going to be easy. But for Hobbes, things were much more grim, even more grim, because for him, that original primordial soup wasn't a nice sweet soup, it was a sort of bitter, horrendous soup in which, yes, we started out in small, isolated little bands, but they weren't kind and they weren't innocent. They were quite the opposite. They were warlike. Originally, way back in the depths of prehistory, life was war. War of everybody against everybody. Life was nasty, brutish, and short. And the only thing that Hobbes felt could have rescued us from this benighted state of affairs were exactly the same repressive mechanisms that Rousseau was complaining about. The creation of governments, police, soldiers, courts of law, prisons, all that kind of thing. So civilization, civil society, in Hobbes' account, arises as a way of taming those base, warlike, competitive instincts, or at least siphoning them off to specific areas of our life, like the economy, where we all get to be like that. So we have these two original versions, if you like, of the humanity in its state of nature. And you might be wondering at this point why scientists today would even be worrying about what philosophers were speculating on hundreds of years ago. But actually, if you pick up a book, especially we noticed after 2008 and the great financial crash, there's a huge interest again in the roots of inequality. And the stories that were told by Rousseau and by Hobbes were being told again, but not this time as a thought experiment or a fable, but as actual accounts of what happened in history, prehistory. Except that the kind of books we're talking about very often were not written by archaeologists or anthropologists. You can find books by famous economists, psychologists or two, the odd biologists, geographers, but actually not the people who actually spend most of their careers investigating this stuff. I don't know why that is, but it's kind of interesting in itself. And the story they tell is this familiar one, where human societies start out very small. Small means simple. Big means complex and hierarchical. And now we are, 8 billion people on the planet. Naturally, we have to just accept those radical social inequalities that are part of civilization. What's the alternative? Well, you'd have to eradicate 99% of the human population and somehow go back to living in tiny egalitarian bands of hunter-gatherers again in the wild. Now, if you think I'm exaggerating, I'll just give you an example. This is from a fairly recent book, The World Until Yesterday, Jared Diamond. Would anyone like to be Jared Diamond this evening? The stage is yours. No volunteers. Large populations can't function, he says, without leaders who make the decisions, executives who carry out the decisions, and bureaucrats who administer the decisions and laws. I'd like you to remember all these points because we're going to come back to them. Alas for you, readers, who are anarchists, God forbid, and dream of living without any state government. Those are the reasons why your dream is unrealistic. You'll have to find... sort of poking fun at you. You'll have to find some tiny band or tribe willing to accept you where no one is a stranger, where kings, presidents, and bureaucrats are unnecessary. Or Yuval Noah Harari says it all much more briefly. There's no way out of the imagined order. When we break down our prison walls and run towards freedom, in fact, we're just running into the more spacious exercise yard of a bigger prison. These books are strangely popular, but also rather depressing. And behind the scenes, archaeologists and anthropologists all over the world have been quietly sort of pecking away like little hobbits, in the land of Mordor, just pecking away at the foundations of this rather dismal story of human history, until we get to the point, or at least this is the case that I'll try to make, we get to the point where the whole foundation starts to look refreshingly shaky. Let's just go over the story once more. So this is let's just call it the wrong story. The wrong story. Remember this. Humans, oh, you already know it. Humans evolved in small-scale egalitarian societies. The agricultural revolution created social inequality. Bureaucracy was invented when societies grew in scale. Living in cities meant putting elites in charge. All right, let's see. Let's start with that first issue of scale. I guess the way that this is usually expressed these days is that here we are living in this wonderful, complex civilization. We have concert houses and things like that. But we're doing it all with a outdated instrument. In our heads, we're carrying around a hunter-gatherer brain. It hasn't evolved much. It hasn't changed all those hundreds of thousands of years. And yet, paradoxically, it's created all of this stuff, these complex, large-scale cultural systems and civilizations. But here we are wandering around, really with something that's rather unfit for purpose. Has anyone heard of that theory, Dunbar's number? Dunbar's number? Named after, thank you. Would you care to explain it? He's, Is that Robin Dunbar down there? Kind of familiar. Thank you. This is a lot easier than I thought. Robin Dunbar, famous primatologist, actually developed his theory initially not for humans, but actually by studying non-human primates, and found this very fascinating phenomenon where there was actually a correspondence between the average group sizes that, say, chimpanzees or bonobos or gorillas would form, and the volume of the brain, specifically the ratio of the neocortex to the volume of the brain, doesn't matter. Then he extended the theory to humans, and based on the same kind of ratios, estimated that we ought to feel comfortable, that's to say, we ought to be able to form, as the gentleman said, kind of deep, abiding, trusting relationships with something in the order of 150 other individuals. Fine. Then he allowed himself to speculate a bit about what happens when group sizes go above that threshold, which is where it all gets a bit strange. He says, well, at that point, we really need to bring in the managers and the police and the governments and politicians and create something that looks rather like a modern nation state. And of course, at that point, we're not really doing history anymore. We're not really doing archaeology. And also, let's just go back to that initial observation. When I say to you, you're running around in this large, complex civilization with a hunter-gatherer brain, I would guess, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would guess that most people would have in their minds, in their hunter-gatherer minds, an image a bit like those of Hobbes and Rousseau. Hunter-gatherer brain means the brain of somebody living in very small, isolated groups, roving around in the landscape and so on. Okay, now look at this. With the kind permission of these two researchers at the Max Planck Institute in Jena, Germany, Jennifer Miller and Yiming Wang, I want to share with you the results of some recent archaeological science. What this very, very clever study shows is that 50,000 years ago, so long, long, long before the invention of agriculture, hunter-gatherers on the African subcontinent were not living in tiny, isolated bands at all. This is a very ingenious study. What they did, very briefly, is study the surviving remains of costumes, personal ornaments, particularly these beads, which are actually made on the shells of ostrich eggs, in very non-random, standardized ways. And through very careful analysis, they showed that not only were these beads traded over huge distances, but whole traditions of manufacture moved through networks, connected societies sharing techniques, sharing knowledge over really staggering distances. I mean, we're talking of distances up to 3,000 kilometers. And in this way, And there's a certain amount of genetic information to back this up. In this way, they reconstruct pathways of cultural transmission, which actually span large parts of the continent. So what's happened to our hypothetical hunter-gatherer brain? Now, just to give you a sense of how radically the science behind some of this prehistoric reconstruction how sophisticated it's become. About 30 or 40 years ago, if you wanted a map of Europe in the Ice Age, you'd probably get something a bit like this. You can see the areas that we're standing in, and most of the British Isles are covered in glaciers. So we're going back 20 or 25,000 years here to the last glacial maximum period. You can see the coasts of the Mediterranean are forested, and then in between the forest and the glaciers, these large empty areas of tundra and also areas of steppe, which would have supported human life, animal life, plant life, probably in quite small sort of sub-regions. Today, we can fill in a lot of this map using techniques like stable isotope analysis. Here's somebody at my institute in London preparing ancient teeth. Is it already primordial soup time? Gosh, I better move on. Never mind the isotopes, I don't really understand them anyway. But when you put those together with archaeology and evidence for the movement of raw materials, you end up with something like this. Again, some brilliant original recent work, this time from the University of Cologne, from Isabel Schmidt and Andreas Zimmermann. And what they're reconstructing here again is the really staggering scale of human connections and interaction, even with very low population densities. And much of that interaction, they argue, was seasonal. Now, what that means is that people are coming together at certain times of year, aggregating, forming large groups, usually in concert with the seasonal migrations of herd animals who they hunt. Deer, woolly mammoth, that kind of thing. And then at other times of year, they're splitting off into smaller groups. Now, this, I suggest, is very interesting, not just from the point of view of ancient demography, if you like, but also from a social point of view. What does it mean for societies to grow and grow and shrink again in social terms? Well, let's go back to that initial idea that in the beginning, we all lived mostly in egalitarian societies, right? Well, look at this. Here we have some artists' reconstructions of actual archaeological finds of burials of Ice Age hunter-gatherers, some of them buried on the steppe, some of them in those forested regions around the Mediterranean. Difficult, I suggest, to talk about straightforward egalitarian societies when you've got individuals, including some children and adolescents, singled out for this kind of treatment, their bodies absolutely saturated with wealth and symbols and things that look like regalia. And it's not just the burials. Yes, for most of the time, it looks like people are living in small, ephemeral campsites, but then sometimes you get this. The opposite happens. People come together to create really impressive public buildings of some scale. This is an excavated example in Russia of one of these mammoth buildings constructed from the bones and the tusks of woolly mammoth. It spans well over 10 meters, probably originally would have been heaped up and covered with animal hides. And you find these things across a whole swathe of Eastern Europe, from Krakow in Poland down to Kiev. What would it even mean to say that there was something like an aristocracy in the Ice Age? And how would we reconcile that with the lack of evidence for anything like kingdoms or states at that time? What kind of society can turn those inequalities on and off, or perhaps just confine them to rituals, like some sort of costume drama? Well, here we discovered that something had happened which historians of science call a Kuhn loss, like Thomas Kuhn, the philosopher of science who wrote in the 1960s the famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. A Kuhn loss is when, let's say, your techniques are becoming more and more sophisticated, those great genetic studies, those stable isotope analyses, but something's going wrong in the underlying interpretive framework. And actually, although your techniques are becoming cleverer and cleverer, you find that you're less able somehow to answer the fundamental questions, what it all means. And actually, you go back to the older paradigms, the ones which have been discarded or fallen out of fashion for no particular reason. You find out that actually, if you put them together with the new techniques, you really get something quite fascinating. This is what we found going back to a somewhat buried anthropological literature from a century ago, like the work of the French sociologist Marcel Mauss, who published a fascinating study of the circumpolar peoples, the Inuit, and their seasonal variations. And he described how for part of the year, in the summer months, they would indeed split off into small bands of hunter-gatherers, go to the coast for fishing and hunting caribou, and those small bands were actually very hierarchical and patriarchal. Fathers had almost complete power over their wives and their children. Private property was obsessively marked. But then in the long winter months, everything changed. People aggregated into these great winter collective houses, almost like communes built from whale ribs. And all those rules of private property vanished. In fact, society became something completely different. It was based on giving things away. Nobody could refuse a request or a demand. Wives shared their husbands, and husbands shared their wives in the great feasts of the festivals of Sedna, the goddess of seals. So, Mauss argued, not just the Inuit, but many other hunter-gatherer societies, early farming societies, have not one, but two social systems. Not one, but two legal systems. Not one, but two moral and religious systems. There were other fascinating examples. The work of the great American anthropologist Robert Lowy, who observed the societies of the Great Plains in North America. Once a year, around the late summertime, when the bison, buffalo, came through in great herds, would create what he called, very explicitly, something like a little state with police and squads of soldiers who would keep everybody in line in the preparations for the annual bison hunt, on which the whole survival of the society really depended. If anyone got out of line, these guys had the power to whip you, beat you, imprison you, maybe even kill you. But then when the hunt was over and the Sundance rituals, which came afterwards, had finished, those coercive powers just melted away. People went back to living in much more egalitarian arrangements. They also rotated the police force, so if you were on the receiving end one year, you'd be giving it out the next year. I think it's a very interesting idea of policing. It changed the way it's done. Now, think about the implications for a moment. We're used to telling the story of human history as a story of sort of progression, from simple to complex, small to large, egalitarian to hierarchical. But these kind of seasonal variations, they screw it all up. It's messy. I mean, you can't go along a sort of ladder of progression like that if people are sort of jumping in and out of different roles on a seasonal basis, sort of floating into and out of private property relations, sometimes very hierarchical, sometimes egalitarian. And they're doing it very consciously. And suddenly you realize, well, hold on a minute. Maybe there was no primordial soup, apart from the drinks, they're still here. Maybe our remote ancestors were not less aware, but actually more aware than we are of certain political possibilities. 1 foot here, 1 foot there. And then you go back to the archaeological evidence. Maybe some of you are familiar with this remarkable site in the Middle East, Göbekli Tepe. It's been in the news a lot. Silence. Never mind. Look at it. This is southern Turkey, near the border of the northern autonomous zone of Syria. These are enormous stone buildings, often referred to as temples, these great multi-ton monoliths, and there are many of them, built by pre-agricultural, non-farming peoples about 10,000 or 11,000 years ago. Remarkable. But what we also know is that after they were built, they were often filled in with the remains of enormous feasts. Huge amounts of animal carcasses and everything sort of went in. So we've got hierarchies being raised up to the sky and then apparently closed down again. And again, the science, the archaeological science, tells us a little bit about what's going on here. So we know, for example, again from isotopic studies, that once or twice even a year, huge herds of Persian or goitered gazelle would migrate through this region, through the Haran plain. So you had periods of great abundance and periods of relative scarcity. In the Americas, too, life before agriculture, we know now, really does not resemble at all the speculations of Hobbes or Rousseau. What you're looking at here is an aerial photograph of the remarkable site of Poverty Point, about 3,500 years old, in what is now the modern state of Louisiana. And this is a vast series of earthworks resembling an amphitheater, the size of an ancient city, built many, many centuries before the arrival of maize farming. So we're talking about hunter-gatherer publics coming together in their thousands to create these earthworks, which can be found in other places all through the American Midwest and the Mississippi Basin. They're still standing there after thousands of years, which is kind of weird, because they're often in sort of river environments where you'd imagine, the mud is just getting eroded and washed away. It's a bit of a miracle. It's like watching an ice cube that won't melt in the sun. And we know the reason for this, thanks to archaeologists like Tristan Kidder in St. Louis, who's pointed out that these people were the Da Vincis of dirt. If you actually look into these mounds, you see that they were brilliant engineers, and they were actually these very, very sophisticated, interlaced layers of soils and gravels placed at specific angles, make these things almost indestructible. Now, that's a lot to take in, isn't it? But let's step back for a moment. What does it all amount to? What does it mean for that favorite concept of the writers of big history books? I'm referring, of course, to the agricultural revolution. Well, let's have a look at what we actually know about the domestication of plants and animals, which is what we're talking about here. First of all, modern archaeology and also genetic studies tell us that plants and animals were not just domesticated in one or two or three places. We know now that there are at least 10 independent centers of domestication scattered all over the world. So why are we even still talking about an agricultural revolution? It's very odd. And there's no reason to think that the results of domestication, the social consequences, were necessarily the same everywhere. Actually, from the archaeological evidence, they look very different in different places. So actually, the whole concept is kind of looking a bit silly these days. And then there's the actual process of domestication. I would suggest to you that 3,000 years is a rather long time for a revolution. Why 3,000? Imagine a 3,000-year revolution. I was going to have a sip. Which one is this? Oh, excellent. Here we go. That's good. I think the hands holding that sickle belong to a late colleague of mine, Gordon Hillman, in London, who actually did experiments. He harvested modern wild wheats with Neolithic technologies, sort of hand sickles. And what he showed is that actually if you want to domesticate wild wheats, you can do it very quickly in a few generations, maybe 20 to 50 years. It's all about how the seeds disperse. Wild ones, the seeds fly off every time there's a gust of wind or an animal brushes by. And in this way, the plants reproduce themselves. But once domesticated, they become sort of silly and useless plants because the the grain becomes attached to the stem and it won't free itself unless a person comes along and beats it or harvests it and threshes it. So that's the main change. And he showed that you can actually make those genetic changes in the plants very quickly if you want to. However, these days we actually have ancient seeds from archaeological sites. I have colleagues who call themselves archaeobotanists. And this is all they do. They look at these seeds. Not all they do, but they mostly look at these seeds. And what they can show is that actually the genetic changes were not happening at anything like that pace. Almost every part of the world where this kind of work has been done, you see that people were taking much longer to actually domesticate these species than was necessary. Now, this isn't because prehistoric people were stupid. It's not because they were inept. Remember, we're talking about foragers, right? We're talking about people who live from wild plants. They're the expert gardeners. It is because they were exploring the possibilities and stepping back, or farming a bit, but also mixing it with a lot of hunting and gathering, perhaps fishing. And actually what we see in various parts of the world is society sometimes moving into agriculture and then out again, altogether. So there really is no single threshold. No, you may have heard this phrase, the wheat trap. It's this idea that humanity fell into the wheat trap. I always struggle to get my head around. I think the idea is that, it's a bit like Rousseau. One day somebody started farming and then he realized, oh God, there's stones in the field, so I have to move the stones. Oh, there's weeds as well, I have to move the wind. Suddenly we're spending all our bloody lives working just to make the blood. We've fallen into the wheat trap. And I've got 50 kids now and, need another drink. I think it's Yuval Noah Harari who says, let's look at the agricultural revolution from the viewpoint of the wheat. Go on. Let's see you try. Why would we? I mean, humans are large-brained, sometimes intelligent primates. Wheat is kind of grass. I mean, it's going to sneak up on you. The wheat domesticated us. No, it's silly. No, there are these long periods, thousands of years. And also, this idea that farming gives rise to private property is a bit odd, because if you actually look at the geographical situation, some of the famous early farming Neolithic sites in the world, like the site of Çatalhöyük on the map there, in the Konya plain of central Turkey, actually the kind of farming they did was kind of lazy. There was none of that stuff going on. Nobody's plowing or anything like that. There are no fields. Actually, they're mostly on the banks of lakes and rivers, and they just wait for the floodwaters to recede. And then you've got this nice fertile soil, and you cast your seeds, and it's like the laziest form of farming, sort of play farming. And there's no point in putting a little fence there, because you come back the next year and it's probably flooded or dry. I mean, it's just, the floods never... Anyway, so, and we can say even more. Actually, what you're looking at here, I won't sort of try and go into detail, probably not even capable of it at this point, but over about 10,000 years, these are all sites from the Middle East. What these ingenious archaeobotanists have found is that the number of arable weed flora, those lovely little colorful plants that love soils that have been disturbed, messed around with cultivated soils, they go up and up and up. So the A's are absence and the P's are presence, and the numbers across the top are dates. But over this long time period, from say 20,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago, there is no corresponding process of domestication. In other words, people are cultivating without domesticating. They're having fun, they're making little gardens, they're favoring their preferred species, but they're not going all the way to agriculture. It's what anthropologists sometimes call low-level food production. So rather than an agricultural revolution, we have humans hovering quite happily on the threshold of farming for thousands of years. Remember that other pillar of the conventional story, bureaucracy. Why was bureaucracy invented? Dunbar's number. Remember, human populations grow and suddenly we can't manage the flow of information and we've got this big society, we need bureaucracy. No, look at this. This is Tel Sabi Abyad, a village about 8,000 years old. This is the true origins of bureaucracy and administration that we know from archaeology. It doesn't start in cities at all. There are no cities in the world at 6000 BC. This is a small village community with probably about 150 or 200 people living in it, and yet they are the first ones to start creating little bureaucratic devices to monitor the movements of goods, and they keep little archives and offices. It's nothing to do with scale at all. And in fact, there are very few signs of inequalities in these societies. Rather like those ancient hunter-gatherers, these early farming societies were networking. They were forming these great regional systems long before the appearance of cities. What you're looking at here is a site that I co-directed the excavations of in Iraqi Kurdistan just a few years ago. And the kind of houses and the kind of objects that come out of excavations in that part of the Middle East, pretty much the same as what you'd find down towards Baghdad or up in the Turkish highlands. In other words, that big red smudge on the map is kind of an area of cultural uniformity. People are sharing forms of cuisine, forms of hospitality, forms of ritual, ways of making houses, looking after their dead, whatever it may be. Strangely enough, this is not what we call civilization. What we usually call civilization are very violent societies like, ancient Rome or the Aztec, the Inca, ancient Egypt, very hierarchical societies. But arguably, here we have a better candidate for civilization. These great zones of regional integration. Societies are small, but they're connected. And what this means is that when cities form, it's not so much like a great expansion. It's more like the opposite. It's more like the contraction of one of these great regional systems down into a single place, or a few places. And archaeology bears this out. When we actually look at the physical remains of the earliest cities in the world, we don't see one phenomenon. We see a whole variety of urban experimentation. Some of them do look very stratified and hierarchical, but a surprising number of them do not at all. And this is quite poignant because a lot of people's minds are obviously on Ukraine at the moment, and actually until recently, Ukraine was producing some of the most interesting and surprising archaeological evidence of early cities. When we think of the origin of cities, I guess most people think of the Middle East, ancient Mesopotamia, where cities go back perhaps 6,000 years. But archaeologists have known for some decades now that north of the Black Sea on the Ukrainian steppe, there were other cities, and they look rather different. So on your right is one of the best known early Iraqi Mesopotamian cities, the site of Uruk, modern Warka in southern Iraq. And you can see in the middle there's an acropolis. There are these great public buildings, probably temples of some sort. Later on there are palaces. Then what you're looking at on the left is one of these early Ukrainian cities, just as large in terms of area, probably some tens of thousands of inhabitants. Nobody quite agrees whether they lived there all year round or some of the year and so on. But in a way, it's the other way around. I mean, it looks like a great big donut, big hole in the middle, and then these radial circles. You may ask how on earth archaeologists can know this. Well, another piece of the scientific toolkit is I wrote it down, the flux gate gradiometer. Sounds like something from Ghostbusters. Actually, it looks like something from Ghostbusters because you go walking through the field, it's very monotonous, hours and hours, over 300 hectares with this thing that looks like a big robotic lawnmower, and all the local farmers are looking over their shoulders. What the hell are they doing? 300 hectares, and what it's doing, it's ground-penetrating signals going into those deep, black, incredibly fertile Chernozem soils of the Ukrainian steppe, and it's picking up the anomalies below the ground. And the anomalies that you see on the maps there, those are the stone foundations of houses. And you end up with a plan like this, where you can see these great radial streets, and then archaeologists have managed to discern the borders of what they think are neighborhoods, and in each neighborhood there's an assembly house. There's no temples, there's no palaces, no royal burials. There's actually no evidence of administration or bureaucracy. All those things that Mr. Jared Diamond tells us ought to be going on by now, they haven't got around to it. And guess what? They carry on for 800 years without getting around to it. Now, perhaps we shouldn't, just pretend it's not there. It's not happening. After all, after 800 years, they do sort of break apart and disappear. We don't quite understand why or where the people go, what happened. Maybe there was a plague of some sort. We don't know. And they don't really leave any strong urban legacy in that region, direct legacy. So maybe the old story is still okay. Maybe we can still say that if hierarchy does set in, when hierarchy does set in, there is no going back, especially when people are living together in such enormous numbers. Wrong. That's not true either. Now feast your eyes on the ancient site of Teotihuacan in the Valley of Mexico, Pyramid of the Moon. Around the year 0, beginning of the Common Era, people started flooding into this place in enormous numbers until the population reached something in the order of 100,000 people. And it all started off much as you might expect, with the construction of these great monuments, the Pyramid of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Moon, the great Temple of the Feathered Serpent. And archaeologists have actually found quite horrific evidence of the ritual killing of captives, their hands bound behind their backs, buried under the foundations of these great monuments. So it's all going quite badly, really, in terms of, And then around 250 AD, 300 AD, archaeologists can't quite agree. Everything changes. People stop building these great monuments. They don't completely abandon them, but there's no more of that. And what they do instead is put their labor, their collective labor, into something else. And something else is housing. And the whole city is divided up into a grid. It's very clearly planned. And when archaeologists started investigating these houses, they found that they were really spectacular. There's these great apartment compounds, single story. Each one might be about, a third of the size of the White House, housing about 3 or 4 nuclear families with a great spacious courtyard, subfloor drainage, beautiful murals on the wall. These days they're all in art museums. And it seems like they managed to put almost everyone in the city into these, what to our eyes would be sort of luxury villas. Actually, when archaeologists first started looking at them, they thought they were palaces. Then they realized everybody's living in a palace. So either everyone's a king, but there we have it. Change of direction. But there may be a writing system at Teotihuacan. In fact, epigraphers think they can begin to decipher it now, but we can't really say very much yet about how this place was really governed. And you may well point out, well, if, it was so possible to have large cities without rulers, without elites, without kings, why didn't the Spanish find them when they started invading this part of the world, Mesoamerica, the 16th century? Why did they only find empires and kings, the Aztec, the Inca? Well, actually, that's not true either. Actually, the place where Hernán Cortés, famous conquistador, found the local allies who sent warriors with him, which allowed him to conquer the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, was exactly one such city without rulers, a place called Tlaxcala. We actually have accounts by Spanish and also some local authors from the time, which describe the political system of Tlaxcala as an indigenous parliament, a kind of democracy. In fact, they had this intriguing thing. If you wanted to be a serving politician in the parliament of Tlaxcala, you had to go through these really horrible rituals. They'd put you in the town square and everyone would abuse you, until your ego was completely smashed. And then you'd be whipped, and then you'd be sent in for a period of seclusion and bloodletting, and you'd be made to think about what it means to serve your community. It's a little bit different from, what we expect politicians today. The Parliament of Tlaxcala. All right, let's go back to where we started with the pillars, the foundations of our standard. What do we call it? The wrong story. I would suggest that if there's a right story that's beginning to emerge, and by the way, it's a very incomplete story. We don't have even half the pieces of the puzzle from archaeology yet to piece things together, but we can at least begin to try. And the outlines, what's coming into view, I would suggest is something along these lines. Ancient hunter-gatherers lived in large-scale networks. No. Bureaucracy began on a small scale. Still don't know why, but it's just there. It's intriguing. And living in cities sometimes, not always, but sometimes could actually mean greater equality. So I guess the only remaining question is, why do we get it all so wrong in the first place? And actually the answer to that, or at least the one that we suggest in our book, The Dawn of Everything, what was it called in Danish?
Ethics of Vensen.
Thank you. Has everything to do with our encounter, that European encounter with the Americas, that colonial encounter with what Europeans then referred to as the New World. A situation in which people who more or less took for granted things like societies based on monarchy, where wealth could be turned into power, and increasingly on bureaucracy, private property, landed wealth, encountered societies, particularly in parts of North America, around the Great Lakes region of what today is Canada and upstate New York. They encountered societies that were shockingly unlike this. Societies in which women had autonomy from men, could get divorced, controlled economic resources. Societies in which there was no obvious way to turn material wealth into power over other people. Societies in which chiefs could give orders, but nobody was obliged to obey them. Power was based on persuasion, oratory. Societies in which cultures of democracy, participatory democracy, were actually far more advanced than in most of Europe at that time. What you're looking at here is the Great Peace of Montreal, signed in 1701, so roughly midway chronologically between Hobbes and Rousseau. And number 5 there is the mark of a famous Huron-Wendat chief who was called Kandirong. He was the speaker of the Wendat nation at that time and was one of many indigenous critics of European civilization whose views of Europe spread through various intermediaries and became part of what we now refer to as the Enlightenment. And actually what we try to show in the book is that in many ways that wrong story, our standard narrative of human history, first emerged at that time in the 18th century, around the middle of the 18th century, as a kind of protective mechanism, a kind of counter-reaction to this very powerful critique from outside, this indigenous critique. It was a story that said effectively, we have nothing to learn from these savages. We have nothing to learn from societies like the one that Kandirong lives in. At best, they can tell us about perhaps what humanity was like all those moons ago in the primordial soup when we lived in a state of nature. So what I've tried to do is explain to you why today, as an archaeologist, I find that particular version of human history unconvincing and out of keeping with modern scientific findings, which of course means that we don't need to rely anymore on that slim range of possibilities set down by exclusively European philosophers during the Enlightenment. We can look at a much wider range of questions and possibilities. Maybe we've been getting the questions wrong all the time. If there is one big burning question about human history, maybe it's not about the origins of inequality. Maybe it's something more along the lines of why. If there's a riddle behind all this, it's why did our species, Homo sapiens, after thousands and thousands of years of constructing hierarchies and then disassembling them, how did the wisest of apes get stuck within relatively durable and stable systems of inequality? And how durable and stable really are those systems? I suggest a drink and some reflection maybe will help us to decide. Thank you very much for listening.